Sometimes the scariest stories aren't urban legends. They're the ones whispered to me by my own subscribers. I've kept this memory buried for years, but sometimes it slips back into my mind at night. When I'm lying in bed and the house is too quiet. It happened when I was 12, and though decades had passed, I still can't convince myself it was just a dream. I know what I saw. I know what I heard. We lived in a suburban neighborhood that seemed perfectly safe. It was the kind of place where kids left their bikes scattered across front lawns, where neighbors waved at each other every evening, and where everyone seemed to believe nothing bad could ever happen. My parents never worried about locking the doors before bed, and I, being a restless child, always insisted on sleeping with my bedroom window cracked open. My room was on the first floor, facing the backyard. Behind our house was a small patch of trees that connected to the neighbor's property. In the daytime, it was harmless, even pretty. But at night, those same trees turned into looming shadows, their branches scraping against one another in the wind like crooked fingers. That summer night was hot. I remember lying on top of my blanket, listening to the crickets outside. The thin curtains over my window swayed just slightly with the warm breeze. I was drifting in and out of sleep when I heard it 3 sharp, deliberate taps on the glass. Knock, knock. My eyes shot open. For a moment, I lay frozen, my brain scrambling for an explanation. A tree branch? A bird? But no. The knocks had been too even, too intentional. Slowly, I turned my head toward the window. That's when I saw it. A figure stood outside, tall, dark silhouette, perfectly still, leaning just close enough to the glass that the outline of a head and shoulders was visible. The moonlight filtered through the backyard, faint but enough to reveal the shape clearly. At first, my mind refused to process it. I remember staring, blinking, hoping it was a trick of my half-asleep brain. But the figure didn't move. It was watching me. I could feel it. It's the same way you can feel when someone's gaze lingers on you too long. My chest tightened, and I tried to convince myself it was my imagination. Maybe I was dreaming. Maybe it was a coat rack, reflected weirdly in the window. Anything but what it looked like. And then the knocking came again. Knock, knock, knock. This time slower, more deliberate. A shiver ran down my spine, and the room suddenly felt ice cold despite the summer heat. I wanted to scream for my parents, but no sound came out. My voice was locked in my throat. My heart was pounding so violently that my entire body felt like it was vibrating. The figure tilted its head, and something about that small movement made it so much worse. Like it was curious, like it was enjoying the way I froze in fear. Couldn't see its face. The curtains were too thin, the moonlight too faint. But I knew without a doubt that it was staring directly at me. I could almost imagine eyes glinting in the dark. And then came a sound I will never forget, the screech of nails, or fingers dragging slowly down the glass. Long, drawn out, deliberate. The sound of something pressing against my window pane with intention. That broke me. I jumped out of bed, ran through the hallway, and bolted up the stairs to my parents' room. Tears blurred my vision as I shook my dad awake, stammering incoherently about someone at my window. My dad, groggy but alarmed, grabbed the baseball bat he kept by the nightstand and stormed downstairs. I clung to my mom, too terrified to move. I could hear the back door opening, my dad's footsteps on the patio. A moment later, silence. Then his voice calling back up. "There's no one out here." I didn't believe him, not entirely. I refused to go back into my room that night, instead curling up on the floor of my parents' bedroom until dawn. The next morning, my dad insisted it had just been a bad dream. But when we went downstairs, I begged him to look at my window. He sighed and humored me. That's when we both saw it. On the glass, faint but undeniable, were smudges, fingerprints, as if someone had pressed their hand against the window and slowly dragged it downward. Above those smudges, written in the condensation, were 3 letters. H the first, a childish, casual greeting. I remember the way my dad's face went pale. He tried to brush it off, saying maybe I'd written it earlier myself. But I knew I hadn't. The letters were too high on the glass. Higher than I could have reached at 12 years old, without standing on my bed. We never talked about it again. My parents didn't call the police. They didn't ask the neighbors. They just told me to keep my window locked from then on. But for weeks afterward, I couldn't sleep. Every time the wind rattled the house or a tree branch scraped the siding, I jumped. I kept imagining that faceless silhouette tilting its head, listening for the sound of my fear. We moved away the following year for reasons unrelated to the incident. But even now as an adult, I never sleep with my window open. Not ever. Because sometimes late at night, when I close my eyes, I swear I can still hear it. Knock, knock, knock. When I agreed to house sit for my aunt, I thought I was getting the easiest gig of my life. She lived alone in a big 2-story home on the outskirts of town, the kind of house with tall windows, old wooden floors, and a lot of character. It was quiet, almost too quiet, but she promised me there'd be plenty of food in the fridge, fast internet, and a generous stack of cash for watching over the place. I arrived on a Friday evening. She was leaving for a week-long vacation, and all I had to do was water her plants and bring in the mail. Easy. The first night felt normal enough. I made myself a frozen pizza, lounged on the couch, and scrolled on my phone until after midnight. But around 1 a.m., I heard something that made my blood run cold. Footsteps. They came from directly above me, slow and heavy, creaking across the floorboards of the upstairs hallway. At first, I thought maybe I was imagining it. The house was old, after all. Houses like that make noises, right? Wood settling, pipes shifting, that kind of thing. But the sound didn't stop, grew more distinct, a measured thump of weight being shifted from one step to another. I sat up, straining my ears, my heart already racing. The footsteps paced back and forth from one end of the hallway to the other, over and over again. Then, after a pause, I heard them descend halfway down the staircase before retreating back up. That's when the panic set in. Someone was inside the house with me. I grabbed my phone with shaking hands and called my aunt. She answered groggily, her voice muffled like she'd just woken up. I told her I was hearing footsteps upstairs, that someone had broken in. Her response didn't comfort me. "Don't go upstairs," she said quickly, almost in a whisper. Her tone wasn't confused. It wasn't dismissive. It was serious, urgent, as if she knew exactly what I was talking about. "What do you mean, don't go upstairs? Are you saying..." But she cut me off. "Listen to me. Just stay downstairs." I didn't want to tell you because I didn't want to scare you, but I've heard the same thing. For months now, my stomach dropped. I asked if she'd ever called the police. She said yes twice. Both times they found nothing. No forced entry, no footprints, no sign that anyone had been in the house. I pressed her for more, my voice trembling. "So what is it then? What's up there?" There was a pause, and then she whispered, "I don't know. It doesn't like being acknowledged. Just ignore it." As she was saying that, the footsteps stopped. The silence was so sudden, it made my skin prickle. And then, from the top of the stairs, a voice called down. It said my name. It's drawn out, mocking, like someone trying to mimic how a friend might say it, except slower, distorted. Every hair on my body stood on end. I couldn't breathe. I whispered into the phone. It just said my name. My aunt's sharp intake of breath was the last thing I heard before I hung up. I couldn't stay in that house another second. I bolted out the front door without shoes, sprinted to my car, and locked myself inside. I spent the rest of the night curled up in the driver's seat, shaking and wide awake. When the sun rose, I reluctantly went back inside. The house was eerily still. Every door was locked, every window shut, just as I'd left them. For a fleeting moment, I wondered if I had dreamt the entire thing, but then I saw them. At the top of the staircase across the landing, there were muddy footprints. Large ones, as though someone had walked through wet soil before pacing back and forth. They led halfway down the hallway, then stopped. It just stopped, as if the person had vanished into thin air. I ran back outside and didn't return until that evening when I brought a friend with me. The next nights weren't much better. Even with someone else in the house, the footsteps returned.
Always.
Upstairs, always pacing. Sometimes we'd hear faint whispers, too quiet to make out. Sometimes the sound of someone dragging their hand along the wall. I lasted 3 more nights before I gave up and went home. My aunt never blamed me. In fact, she admitted that she rarely slept upstairs anymore herself. She'd hear the pacing most often in the small hours of the night, like someone trapped in an endless loop, walking back and forth. To this day, she still lives there. And when I asked her recently if the sounds had stopped, she shook her head. "They're still up there," she said quietly. "Sometimes it's worse. Sometimes they try the stairs. I haven't been back since. But even now, sometimes when my own house creaks at night, I feel a chill crawl up my spine, because I'll never forget that voice calling my name from the top of the stairs." In college, I rented a cheap off-campus apartment with 2 roommates. It wasn't the nicest place. We had leaky faucets, thin walls, and a constant draft, no matter how high we turned up the heat. But it was affordable, and at that age, affordability was all that mattered. My room was the smallest of the 3, but it had one feature that I actually liked: a walk-in closet. It wasn't too much by normal standards, just a narrow rectangular space with a shelf and a hanging rod. But it was more than enough for my clothes and storage boxes. At first, I appreciated having it. By the end of the year, I couldn't even look at that door without my stomach twisting. It started subtly. A few weeks into the semester, I noticed the closet door cracked open when I was certain I'd closed it. I thought maybe one of my roommates had been in my room borrowing something, or maybe I just forgot. But it kept happening. I'd shut the door before going to class, come back, and find it ajar by a few inches. One night I was lying in bed, scrolling on my laptop, when I heard it faint, deliberate breathing coming from inside the closet. At first I laughed nervously, telling myself it was my imagination or maybe air shifting through the vent. But the longer I listened, the clearer it became. Slow inhales, shaky exhales, as if someone was trying and failing to stay quiet. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning, I checked inside. Nothing but clothes, boxes, and the faint smell of dust. I told myself it was just stress from midterms messing with my head. But things escalated. I began waking up in the middle of the night, certain I'd heard a noise. Sometimes it was soft shuffling, sometimes a faint creak like weight shifting on the floorboards, always from inside the closet. I started keeping the door shut and stacking a chair in front of it at night. One morning after another restless night, I noticed deep scratch marks along the inside edge of the closet door. Long, uneven grooves carved into the wood. I hadn't seen them before. My roommates swore they hadn't touched my room, but they started joking about how I looked pale and tired, how I seemed haunted. I laughed it off, but inside I was unraveling. The worst night happened in late October. I remember it vividly. I was exhausted, desperate for sleep, so I forced myself to ignore the usual paranoia and turned off the light. The room was silent, except for the hum of my fan. At some point past 2 a.m., I woke up suddenly. Not from a dream, but because I heard something. The closet door creaked. Very slowly it opened. I froze, staring into the darkness, my body refusing to move. The chair ID propped against the door slid across the floor as though nudged from the other side. And then, through the crack of the doorway, I saw Aitin outline. A human shape crouched low as if trying to stay hidden. I couldn't see details, only the darker black of its form against the dark room. For what felt like forever, we just stayed like that, me lying rigid in bed. It crouched silently in my closet doorway. Then in a low, rasping voice, it whispered, "I know you're awake." My scream caught in my throat. I bolted upright, fumbled for the lamp, and when the light clicked on, the closet was empty. Chair tipped over, door wide open, but nothing inside. I barely slept the rest of the semester. My roommates eventually admitted they'd been hearing things to footsteps in the hall at night when nobody was up, the sound of humming from my room when I wasn't home. One of them swore he saw the closet door shut on its own while passing by. By December, I begged my parents to let me move back home and commute. I didn't care about the inconvenience. I couldn't stay another night there. On my last day in that apartment, I was packing up my clothes when I noticed something carved into the back wall of the closet. Hidden behind a stack of boxes I hadn't moved all semester, words scratched into the plaster. "Still here?" I left the boxes behind. Years later, I sometimes dream about that closet. In the dream, the door creaks open, and I see the same crouched figure, waiting patiently, whispering that same phrase. I always wake up drenched in sweat, my heart hammering like it's still that night in October. I haven't had a walk-in closet since, and I never will.